Welcome to Al Bernstein Unplugged Unboxing. In a 40-year Hall of Fame career, Al has chronicled some of the greatest moments in boxing history. On this podcast, you get to hear him expand on those memories and talk about the current news in the sport of boxing. You also hear Al interview some of the biggest names in the sport. Here's Al Bernstein Unplugged.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the show. We're happy you joined us. This is a show where we, every week, get to interview one of the biggest names in the sport of boxing. And on this particular show, we're going to deal with a very difficult but important subject. It's about a book that Tris Dixon wrote, and Tris will be joining us to talk about his book, Damage, the Untold Story of Brain Trauma in Boxing, put out by Hagler Publications. It's a really fine book, a very difficult undertaking for Tris, and he did an excellent job in writing it. And we're going to talk about that. It's an important book that needed to be written, and I believe needs to be read by as many people as possible. Now, to help me with the show as my co-host and help us with also the questions that you send in on Twitter at Al Bernstein, my good friend Trip Mitchell. Hi, Trip. How are you?
I'm great, Al, and I had a chance to watch from the memorial service back in Brockton for marvelous Marvin Hagler, and you did a great job. You followed Stephen Smith, and the two of you guys together was very proud. Great job.
Yeah, it was fun. If you can call that fun, but it was in a way because it was a celebration of his life. It was held on the day that would have been Marvin's 67th birthday. You mentioned Stephen A. Smith was there. He's obviously a boxing fan and a fan of Marvin Hagler's. And Bernard Hopkins, who took the torch that was passed on in a way from the middleweight division from Marvin Hagler and became himself an icon in that division. And a number of other boxing folks there. And Tommy Hearns made a surprise appearance. People did not expect him to get there, and he did, and that was wonderful. And they had a video segment in which Ray Leonard and many other boxing folks gave their condolences to the Hagler family and talked about Marvin. And it was a wonderful event. You know, I think it was something that May Lang, Marvin's mother, really appreciated, and it was. I'm glad I went to it, and I'm glad I was able to officially kind of say goodbye to Marvin.
Well, that was fantastic, and those of your fans and fans of boxing can watch that. And again, great job. Well, let's get right to the questions, and let's start with a question about lightweights. Well, one-time lightweights, that is. Rob Ovid asks, fighting as lightweights in their prime, who would win between Duran and Mayweather?
Interesting. Those are always, of course, the hot stove kind of questions that boxing fans debate in bars all across the world. and when you take them generationally, it's a question you can never answer for sure, but everybody has an opinion. This one's interesting because our questioner designated the lightweight division where Duran and Mayweather fought at many different divisions. And at lightweight, Roberto Duran had a longer run as a lightweight, much longer than Mayweather did. He won the title in 1972 from Ken Buchanan, and kept it for, I think, 7 years. And Mayweather, on the other hand, won his title from Jose Luis Castillo and kept it for, I think, 2.5 years or 3 years in the early 2000s. And it's important that I mention Jose Luis Castillo because that has bearing on my answer here. Mayweather won the title in a hotly disputed and controversial decision against Castillo. Many people thought that Mayweather lost that fight. He would fight Castillo in a rematch, win that one by a little more, and that one I think most people think he did win, though again it was a very close fight. And that kind of guides me in my thinking about what might happen if Duran and Mayweather fought. Because Mayweather had so many problems dealing with Castillo, Roberto Duran fought a very similar kind of swarming style. But Roberto Duran to be honest, was certainly a better lightweight than Jose Luis Castillo, though Castillo was terrific. And so given that kind of information to work with, I kind of have to lean toward Roberto Duran in this fight. It's almost impossible to say for sure. And this is in no way denigrating Floyd, who, of course, one of the great fighters and was very good at lightweight. But I think if I had to make a pick, it would probably be Duran.
Okay, good information. And our next question from Wreck-It Walk. With recent news of 2 big bouts in the last week, which do you see actually happening, and which has the potential biggest impact on Wilder Fury or Pacquiao Spence?
Oh, which one has the biggest impact on the sport? Yeah, I think they're both going to happen, and they're both going to happen in Las Vegas, and they will both have a big impact on the sport. Wilder Fury, an even bigger impact because there's more future things that are probably at play because of it. Whoever wins has Anthony Joshua waiting in the wings. Fury was already signed to fight him until he lost the arbitration, and now has to do his third fight with Wilder. And so, it's going to have a big impact on how the heavyweight division moves forward. Now, the Spence-Pacquiao fight, which is very interesting, that could too have importance, certainly, because if Pacquiao pulled off an upset, that would certainly upset the apple cart in the welterweight division. Pacquiao will be the underdog in that fight. Kudos to him for taking it at age 42, for him to go take on Errol Spence, certainly one of the 2 best welterweights in the world, along with Terence Crawford. Though Sean Porter, who fought Spence to a standstill, would argue he should be in that conversation, and probably should. But the fact is that I think that if Spence wins, then the welterweight division stays kind of where it is. So that might have a little less impact overall if Spence wins. But if Pacquiao wins, that would have a huge impact on the sport of boxing, because it would affect what is arguably the premier division in boxing, the welterweight division. I mentioned at the beginning that we're going to be chatting with a gentleman who is a terrific writer. Tris Dixon is his name. He was a former editor of Boxing News. He's been covering boxing since 1996, and he has written 3 previous boxing books, including one on Floyd Mayweather, interestingly. But he has now has a book that's just coming out that probably is the most important thing he's done as a writer in boxing. The book is called Damage, and it's the untold story of brain trauma in boxing. And it's a very comprehensive look at the history of that problem in boxing, the study of it, the impact it's had on fighters and families of fighters, and also what can be done to help try and mitigate the issue. Boxing is a difficult sport, and this topic is a tough one to discuss. It's one of those things that we understand it's part of the sport, but finding a way to deal with it and make it better, especially for the fighters that are victims of it, is a really important topic. And, this book has many poignant moments in it, but it's not just a woe is me tale about either the fighters and it's not a negative view of the sport because of this issue. It is more an honest look at it so that everyone can assess it as an issue and think about how to move forward with it. So with that having been said, here's the man that wrote the book Damage, Tris Dixon. Tris, thanks for doing the show and talking to us about your new book, which is an important one for the sport of boxing and for boxing fans, and extraordinarily well written, and has information in it that I think, though some of it is difficult for us to absorb, needs to be talked about. Why did you decide to do this specific kind of book? What was it that ultimately motivated you to write a book, about this difficult topic?
Do you know, it's partly for the exact reason that you mentioned there, Al, is that I want people to be able to talk about it so that it's no longer a hard conversation to have. I want it to be a part of the conversation for boxing and for fight fans. And I want people to not just understand the risks about the long-term consequences of boxing, but to be able to change stigmas about what happens to fighters. Obviously, I've been close to many fighters over the years. When I think back to Matthew Saad, Muhammad, and Aaron Pryor, these were good friends of mine, and it was sad to see what happened to these guys. And I want more for old and retired or ex-retired fighters than those guys had in their lives, and I want them to have a better future, and I want them to have a world of understanding where they're not mocked, taunted, or anything for being, in inverted commas here, punchy. I don't think the NFL struggles here with CTE, and I don't think there's a negative stigma attached to football players who struggle in life after football. But for some reason, boxing, these guys have been mocked for generations, and it's time to stop that, because these are warriors who deserve so much more. They've given us everything, and they deserve a damn sight more respect than they've been given over the years.
That's well put. I debated when we were going to do the interview whether I was going to use this statement that's in the book at the beginning of the interview or save it to the end. And I decided to use it at the beginning so that people would understand even better how you view this, because this book has a lot of material in it that is, doesn't speak to the best side of boxing in terms of the impact it has on human beings, how sometimes people are insensitive, as you point out, to it, how sometimes the business of boxing doesn't lend itself correctly to servicing the boxers. And yet, I want to say this, a very, very interesting statement you made toward the end of the book, early in our interview, so people understand your viewpoint. You had a great line toward the end of the book that said, boxing has saved more souls than it has taken. And I thought that was a brilliantly, as you were kind of doing a summation to explain, look, I'm not talking about the abolition of boxing. I'm not talking about, denigrating the sport as a sport. But what you wrote there is so true, because, from youngsters that walk in, I do a lot of work with amateur boxing in the United States, and you've seen it on your side of the pond and everywhere else. The people that boxing has helped are a legion of people.
Yeah, of course. And, I'm a boxing guy. So, I mean, I'm not part of the anti-boxing brigade or the banned boxing brigade. That's not where I'm going with this at all. And if anyone draws that as a conclusion, they've gone the wrong way with it entirely.
Right.
I obviously want to help the sport, and one of the reasons is for what you say there. The sport does do so much for communities, for individuals. Hey, I could point to my own life. My life was going down a different direction when I was 18, 19, 20. But through boxing and having boxing and being part of a boxing club and being part of a community, it kept me on the straight and narrow, and it made me disciplined, and it instilled things that are still with me today. I still train. I still have routines. I still have discipline. I'm careful with my diet, and all of that came from boxing for me. And then I think of my own coach, and I'm talking at a very low level here, my own local coach, a guy who was a very bad dude back in the day, basically looked like he was going to be a career criminal. And then he's wound up being a wise old sage to boxing, to young urchins for generations. So boxing has done so much. And obviously I then think about the people I've trained and fought with and all that kind of stuff. And then obviously you look at the bigger picture and the hope that it gives so many people, and you'll know it's such a well-worn cliche, but it is a way out for a lot of people. The thing is, it's just about, in terms of the book now, it's about arming these guys and equipping them with enough knowledge to think, hang on, when your career's done at 30, 35 or 40, however old you are, there is a life after boxing. You need to be prepared for it. because it's going to come up and try and kick your ass.
Yeah, true. Now, in the book, you do a great job of, I've never anything as comprehensive in terms of you going back and describing the various kinds of studies that have been done on boxers and the work that's been done on this. And you go all the way back to Dr. Harrison Martland and also Harry L. Parker, who was another person that continued his work. And very early, in the early 1900s, they were doing work on trying to understand the dangers of boxing. And they were kind of the forerunners, weren't they, of all the studies that we've seen done on this?
Yeah, and it's crazy to think, because this is really where it came about for me. I was reading a book called The League of Denial, which is about the NFL's concussion crisis, which came out a few years ago. And I was reading about CTE, and it wasn't linked. I wasn't reading it with a link to boxing in mind. I was just reading about CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is what these guys struggle with in retirement. And then through the book, obviously, basically told me that CTE was actually a more modernized term of what Harrison Martland called punch drunk syndrome. And basically, Martland's study, he was a promoter brought him in the region of 20 fighters and said, look, something's not quite right with these fighters. And they had various symptoms, whether it was cognitive symptoms or behavioral symptoms. These guys had changed over time, and some of them might have slurred speech, some of them might be walking unsteadily, some of them might have become hugely depressed, some of them might have become very impulsive and had mood swings. Anyway, he had these 20-odd guys that he brought to Harrison Martland, whoever this promoter was, and he said to Martland, what do you make of these guys? And the thing was, because there was so little medical literature, or no medical literature about it at the time, Martland actually was very good, and he said, well, hang on, you're the boxing people, you tell me, what's happened. And so the early scientists who were talking about this actually gave a lot of credence to what they called as lay people, so boxing people who had witnessed the change, the decline in fighters. Obviously now times evolved, and obviously I think that there's plenty of neurologists out there that have worked with ex-boxers and so forth that are more clued up, but Martland was a real pioneer, and his work is still referred to regularly in this day and age, which is incredible, because the paper was 1928, so we're nearly 100 years on from it, and he was the first guy.
That's pretty amazing that it still is pertinent. One of the fighters from that era who was concerned about himself, and he was a very well-educated and insightful man, was Gene Tunney, who, of course, ended up winning the heavyweight championship, former Marine. And he worried, didn't he? And, of course, he did retire pretty early. He worried about what effects boxing might have on him.
Yeah, he did. There was a line when he retired, he felt something happen to him in a sparring session. And he's like, this is a warning, this is a red flag. And so, he was one of the very chosen few who went out on his terms and went out on top. And it proved to be a shrewd move. But then he struggled down the line as well. So sometimes when you think these guys have got out, and I'm not saying cognitively, but he had his battles with drink and other things that, with hindsight, what we now know in terms of, CTE and how it can lead to addictions and other issues like that, then, maybe he did, because he sustained, I think it was against Harry Greb where he sustained a real beating, and obviously he stuck around a long time and boxed at all levels, Gene Tunney, and through the weights. So it's, he was very aware of it though. And I think he even wrote about it in his autobiography, that was one of the reasons why he got out when he did, thinking, hang on, I think this is enough.
Yeah, he was insightful enough to know. One of the things you write about is a gentleman, John Arthur Corsellis, who studied actual brains of boxers after he collected brains of many different kinds for studies, and that included the brains of boxers after they'd passed away. And he did physical studies of what their brains looked like, and had some interesting, insights on that level.
Yeah, there are still people that think Corsellis's work is the go-to work, even now, sort of 50, 60 years on. I tend to disagree, because, scientific studies have moved on so much more. But what he did that was so crucial was he would look at a brain and in his assessment of a brain, he would then marry up with his team of researchers what behavioral changes whoever owned the brain. He would then try and say, well, what part of the brain is damaged and what's actually happening to to the fighter. So he'd think, oh, look, if that part's damaged there, then maybe that's affecting how they walk. If that bit's damaged there, then maybe that's the bit that affects the memory. And so his neuropathology was pioneering in the sense that he actually started to put the pieces together about what damage was being done and how it was affecting these guys.
So that was it struck me that might have been a pretty important in terms of the study of this.
Hugely important, and like I said, people still say, they sort of discredit some of the more modern neuroscience and go back to Corsellis and say, well, no, this is the man.
Interesting. One of the fighters, of course, perhaps the most famous fighter of all time, Muhammad Ali, is an interesting part of this discussion because clearly we saw his deterioration after his boxing career, getting Parkinson's disease. But one of the things that is up for debate, or at least has been debated, is whether, because there was Parkinson's in the family prior to that, how much was brought on by boxing, what impact boxing specifically had, and people have different motivations for saying yes or no to that question. So Ali becomes, and you devote a lot of time in the book to discussing Ali's situation. It's one of the interesting parts of this that people have a hard time wrapping their brains around.
Yeah, of course. And I think, there's multiple reasons for this. And I think, you can go back to Martland's paper and some of the earlier studies where these scientists were saying, oh, it's not going to happen to the good fighters. It's going to happen to the journeymen or to the sparring partners or to the guys that sit in whatever color they used to use before the blue corner, but, in the black and white days. So it was, basically you were going to be in trouble if you weren't very good. And I think this is where the stigmas come from as well, where, if you wind up and you're suffering in life after boxing, people say, oh, you can't have been very good. And obviously we know how vain Ali was, the terrific Ali, and how he prided himself in, obviously, for a long period of time, being the guy that you couldn't hit. And Ali is, just going back to the research as well, obviously Thomas Hauser, who wrote the brilliant book on
Right.
Ali, he was privy to a lot of the confidential medical papers while writing Ali's book with him. And, it seems, that he was very much told and given the impression that Ali's damage was down to boxing. And it was the Ali family that chose to go the Parkinson's route. And obviously now it's hard to tell, obviously, what damage that would have been or how different things could have been if Ali had said, this is down to boxing, we need to do something about this. But obviously they've gone a completely different route. And so, we don't know what difference it could have made. But obviously, as you can tell from the book, there are voices out there saying that they wish that he'd championed the cause of ex-fighters who struggled, because his name would have been, would have got so much momentum and so much publicity towards change and helping ex-fighters.
And they would say, of course, he did do a lot of work on as far as Parkinson's is concerned, and that was kind of the direction that they took it in. And many people talked about how in the latter portions of his career, when he was employing the RopeaDope and took even so many more punches, that might have been part of the time, though, from a boxing standpoint, that really did a lot of excess damage to him. And some of the people that you talked to suggest that was like the final piece to the puzzle that caused all this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll never know definitively, will we? But I think, when you hear about those horror sparring stories in Deer Lake, when he was going, having it all out with Larry Holmes and, actual, guys who were going to win the heavyweight title, I think Dokes and Weaver, or guys of that ilk, young, hungry studs that were coming through, Tim Witherspoon and stuff, and he was an old man, a guy who was dyeing his hair to make him look younger and doing all the tricks of the trade he could to try and cling on to his youth, which had come and gone. But I think I quoted the book that CompuBox brought out, Ali by the numbers, and they've done the punch stats of those last fights, which people refer to. So the Ernie Shavers fight, both fights with Leon Spinks, and then Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick. And, you know, there's several thousand more punches and several long, arduous training camps to add on top of the damage that he'd already acquired over 20 or 30 years of taking punches to the head.
In your book, you talk about, with a number of people, including one of my former broadcasting mates, Paulie Malignaggi, and others, about the idea of sparring. You know, this is the conundrum with boxing, right? Boxers need to spar. And it's a necessity to get better. And yet the volume of the sparring, oftentimes, many people have suggested, is as much a cause of these issues that boxers have as the actual fights they were in. And Freddie Roach, the Hall of Fame trainer, who has himself suffered issues post-boxing, even cut down some of the sparring that some of his fighters have done. This is a thorny issue, though, isn't it, in terms of safety?
Yeah, and listen, I don't know if you guys use the word woke over in the US. I don't want to come across as a woke individual that's, you know, trying to, some sort of hipster, sort of left-wing hipster trying to, wear cushions for gloves and wear motorcycle helmets and stuff. I'm not like that. You know, I think that, you know, Mickey Ward says, you know, 90% of his damages was done in sparring, and he would have sparred less had he known then what he knows now. So, you know, using the power of experience and someone's own admission, I think that's quite a powerful statement. And, you know, you can implement change, and you can see things from a different perspective once you understand what's going on. For example, you know, you'll know Dominic Ingle in the Sheffield gym here. A vast amount of the sparring they do in that gym is body sparring. And I must say, you know, I've seen sparring all over the world. Some of the most savage sessions I've seen has been their body sparring, where they go all out to the body. And I think, I'm working on a book now about Matthew Saad Muhammad, and I'm looking at, you know, at the end of his career, he was still sparring 150 rounds for a fight.
Wow.
And, you know, this is when this is when the horse was already out of the barn for Matthew as well. Like, his career had come and gone, and he was starting to struggle a little bit. And I just think, you know, people should be aware of how many rounds they're putting in the bank, and the type of rounds they're putting in the bank. And they need to be aware. And I think there possibly does need to be a change in the culture. You know, I mentioned in the book, when I trained with Kevin Rooney up in Catskill, I'm sure I sustained a concussion one day. And I went back to the gym the next day, and Kevin says, "Oh, you know, I want 4 rounds out of you." That's absolutely fine, because I'm a boxer. That's what I was a boxer. I was there to impress Kevin. I'm not going to say, "Oh, sorry, boss, I've got a sore head from yesterday," because then I look like a wimp. But that's the sort of culture where you need to be able to put your hand up and say, "Sorry, boss, you know, yesterday you got me with a great shot, and, you know, I'm not feeling it today." And it's not being a wimp. You know, there's real dangers out there with second
and that doesn't
stuff.
Yeah, and you know, that very seldom happens in boxing gyms where you can put your hand up and do that. I don't even know if it happens now. I remember a million years ago being an amateur boxer, and you'd never think of, as you pointed out, you'd never think of saying that to somebody that wants you to spar an extra 3 or 4 rounds. It's just unlikely to happen.
No, but then, you know, we had a bad example with, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Nick Blackwell story, where he got buzzed in sparring a few days before he fought Chris Eubank Jr. Yeah. And he either got dropped or certainly hurt by George Groves. And he said, whatever it was, he still fought Chris Eubank a few days later. And then obviously after the Chris Eubank fight, he was in a coma. And, you know, was it that he went in with the damage? And you'll understand this as well. I mean, I remember sitting down with Don Fulmer in Don Fulmer's house, and he was telling me about the beating that Gene Fulmer put on Benny Kid Paret. And if you look at the timeline, that fight, that war that Gene had with Benny Paret came very, very soon before Benny Paret fought Emil Griffith. And Don actually thought that was the smoking gun that did the main damage for Benny Paret, the fact that he hadn't recovered from the fight with Fulmer, which I think was just a matter of weeks beforehand. And so I think there's this thing where, you know, and we see it in football where people are becoming more understanding about it. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be happening overnight, but people are going to have to think, not just for the long-term health, but if someone wants to perform in a fight, they can't go in with a concussion. They can't go in with what is literally a brain injury, and you know, the chances of something bad happen go up exponentially if you actually do that. So it's just not worth taking the risk.
And do you see in the sport of boxing sub-evolution of the thinking? We've seen certain things. We see fighters fighting less. We see people thinking about how much they should spar. Do you see some evolution in how people are approaching things because you talk to so many people about this book, for this book. Do you see a change in thinking?
Well, I mean, the only thing I can say to that, Al, is let's see who cares. Who cares about these fighters afterwards? If they care, then things need to change, because the scrap heap of old fighters is too big. It's too great. The number of the damaged guys that don't get the care, the love, and the attention they deserve afterwards is too big. So we have the responsibility to end the cycle. It's down to those people who say they care about the fighters to actually start implementing these sort of things that will look after them down the line. So I'd like to think so. I'd like to think, because you see, or you're on social media, oh, this guy's wonderful, or, you know, this, that, and the other. The problem is, you know, boxing's so fast paced, and you'll know obviously all about this from social media and everything that's going on all the time.
Yeah.
Is the sense that, you know, you get a damaged fighter and, you know, there's a GoFundMe page and it's set up and everyone's like, oh, brilliant, let's help him out. 2 days later, everyone's back to talking about Fury Joshua again, and, you know, someone else is thrown off the back of the treadmill and forgotten about.
It is staggering to me that people are so quick to criticize boxers who either retire from a fight because they feel they've been injured or have a clear injury, and people find it difficult to believe that they would have retired from a fight and realize that they shouldn't go on. You know, I understand it's a warrior sport, and we've all been involved in it many years, and like you know, many of us have been in the ring and approached the sport from that standpoint. But still, it surprises me.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, and we've had it. You know, the two most notable ones that spring to mind are obviously Daniel Dubois against Joe Joyce, and then Billy Joe Saunders against Canelo recently, where, you know, I think it wouldn't surprise me if the word quit is actually trending on Twitter on these nights.
Yeah.
Because everyone says these guys are quitting. And, you know, like obviously the book is about long-term brain injuries. So not what happens on fight night, but obviously what happens on fight night can have a big impact on what happens to these guys down the line. And, you know, particularly in the case, I mean, I can't say particularly in the case of Dubois, but in both cases, really, you know, the guys are basically half blind. And in Dubois, it was his lead eye, and he wasn't getting out of the way of those right hands. So, you know, and Joyce is obviously a big puncher. So what's to gain by going out on your shield? You know, why don't you just chalk it up and chalk it off and say, look, lost to the better man, I'll come back. I don't need to take another 6 minutes of this because I can't see what's hitting me. I can't get out of the way of it. You know, it's not, you know, whether I go 12 rounds or 10 rounds, I still lost. But obviously we have this stigma where people want you to go out on your shield, and it's because, you know, we're so lucky with the sport that we cover, and I love it so much. We see these guys like Ward and Gatti and Corrales and Castillo, and, you know, going back, we see the greats like Rocky Marciano, and these guys are warriors that fought for, you know, Marciano with his nose hanging off, and Danny Williams with his shoulder hanging out of his socket. And we've seen these guys with exceptional courage, that's become the norm. And people are like, that's exceptional. That's exceptional. That's above and beyond. You don't need to give us that. You don't need to give us your livelihood or your future. You know, we're here for the sport. You know, what other sport would say, you know, say in football over there, if someone gets, you know, a serious injury and they come off and want to be substituted, oh, so you quit. I haven't heard that in football or anything else. It's strange why, you know, people want their boxers to be absolute alpha males, you know, absolute men's men, and I guess now they want the women to be as tough as possible as well. And it's just, you know, that we don't require that. We don't require these guys to put their lives on the line. We shouldn't make that the standard.
Yeah, very good point. You talk to a lot of people for this book, relatives of boxers who have suffered brain damage and who've had difficult moments after they were done with the sport. A lot of friends. Those had to be very hard conversations, and the way you write about them in the book, they're very poignant and heartfelt. That had to be a difficult process, even to just go through doing all those interviews.
Yeah, by far the toughest part. You know, I can almost triggers a bit of emotion within me now, knowing how brave those women are, and you're referring to Frankie Pryor, Aaron's widow, and Brenda Spinks, who's now obviously Leon's widow, and the fact that they shared so much with me. And obviously Aaron I knew well. Like, I'd been to Aaron and Frankie's home and sat on Aaron's couch and watched Pryor Cervantes with him, and I watched Pryor Arguello, the legendary night show with Aaron. And so I've known them for years. And then when Aaron died, Frankie and I stayed in touch. So to speak, when I phoned Frankie and said I was doing the book, it was really a catch up. It wasn't really for the book. And then she was so good about it and so open, talking about Aaron and how he was diagnosed with dementia, but obviously it was CTE. And really, her, Rose Norton, Ken's widow, and Brenda Spinks, and Kay Hagler now as well, like they formed this first wives club of CTE in boxing. And they've been extraordinarily strong. And to spend the day or the morning with Brenda and Leon a couple of years ago, I wanted to spend the time with Leon because I knew he was such a high profile, severe CTE sufferer. And to see how Brenda looked after him, it was just awe-inspiring. And I know Frankie had the same stuff with Aaron, but to know the ins and outs of hospital visits and medication and, changing the landscape of how their house looked, the dynamic, and sort of making it wheelchair accessible and everything else that they did. They were there for their men. They were there. By the end of the book, they were the heroes to me more than the fighters. And I say that with all due respect to the boxers, but those women gave of serious chunks of their life to make Aaron and Leon's lives better.
Remarkable that these, both them and other people were, would have those conversations with you for this book, and hats off to them and others that talk to you that know the sport to help you illuminate people about this problem.
Yeah, I suppose that was one of the things out intermittently through this process. I remember speaking to Bobby Quarry, who's the surviving Quarry sibling. And I spoke to Dr. Robert Cantu, who's one of the leading doctors in Boston. And there were numerous other people, including Frankie Pryor. And they almost said the exact same quote. They said, this is a great thing that you're doing. And that really sort of bolstered me through through some low moments. And, the book's been 4 years in the making. So obviously it's a roller coaster in its own right of highs and lows and things that go on in my own life and all the rest of it during those periods. But for the fact that those people would say, what you're doing isn't just helping the sport, but it's helping families and people like us. And for the neurosurgeons and neuroscientists to say, what you're doing is good because this stuff people need to be aware of it. That really boosted me at moments where I needed it through the writing of the book, for sure.
So the book is called Damage. It is a wonderful effort by Tris to tell the story of what boxers have faced in terms of damage that they've suffered, and also how they've gotten through it and how their family has, and also talks about what can be done, what has been done, and some of the issues that have happened to boxers. But I want to read the last paragraph of the book and have Tris respond to it, because I think he did a great job of summing up this whole issue. And he writes, "It's time to be open about it and time to talk about it. It's time boxing confronts its own worst problem, stops ignoring it, and steps up to address it at all levels. This is a sport of courage, and it will take bravery, but it's happened in football, soccer, and rugby, although it should not be up to other sports to take on boxing's biggest fight." I thought that last paragraph was very well put, and I think explains to us that this is a problem we need to talk about and deal with. It can't just be pushed under the rug.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to the sort of closeness I felt with fighters and the respect I have them. I remember going to the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and I'll just say that, for instance, back in 2000 or 2001 for the very first time. And I saw heroes of mine, and it wasn't the way that I remembered them from when I used to watch them on TV. And it was very sad and sobering. And as a fan at the time, you kind of put that to the back of your mind. And you think, oh, I remember, you're so enamored and so in awe of these guys that you think these are still the same people that you're meeting, but they're not. They've changed over the years, and boxing has, by and large, done that to them. And I think it's really important that we have sympathy for these guys, but we understand what's happening to them, and that they understand what's happening to them too, because there's people I interviewed for the book that have CTE and they haven't realized what's going on with them. And there are fighters now that are thinking, that not too much older than me, and I'm in my early 40s, and they're thinking, and they say they're in broadcast work, they're thinking, is my speech going now, or is my memory going, and am I going to lose my job over it? So there are people out there that are thinking about it, but it needs to be something where it is part of the conversation. And that's what the book is about, really. Hey, it was uncomfortable to write, to try and make it more comfortable for other people to talk about. So it is part of the conversation. It's peeling a scab of boxing so that it can heal. And obviously there are things in the book where we talk about the amount of sparring, where we talk about more strict licensing on fighters so they can't slip through loopholes like Muhammad Ali, who wound up having that horrible fight in the Bahamas, just for instance. And obviously there's the possibility or the plausibility of whether we can have an international body where at least medical data stays shared amongst different regulatory bodies, so that if you fail a brain scan somewhere, you can't go and get licensed somewhere else because it's not in yours or the sport's best interest. And I think, some of this stuff is really important. And it's slightly embarrassing that boxing still hasn't got its head around it now in 2021. But this is, now's the time. Other sports are reacting to what's going on. The NFL has changed its return to play policies. It's changed its preseason procedures. Soccer's now looking at heading the footballs for children under 14 worldwide. Rugby League are taking different protocols in terms of substitutions. In soccer, there was a concussion substitution made just last night in a Premier League football game. And that means that doesn't count as one of your actual substitutions because it's a head injury. All these sports are reacting. Yet this goes back to Harrison Martland in 1928 when he did punch drunk syndrome. And it's boxing's problem. So what's boxing doing about it?
Yeah, well, the book now is not just a litany of stories. It deals, as you point out, with the measures that have been taken, the ones that should be taken, and the ones that need to be studied and figured out. So it gives a broad picture of this whole issue. It is a terrific work by you. Congrats on writing it. It was not an easy project, I'm sure. And thanks for coming on and sharing it. I hope a lot of people will get this book to help them understand what's going on in the sport.
Thank you very much for having me, Al. It's an absolute privilege, and I've really enjoyed it.
So I hope you were enlightened by and found interesting that conversation with Tris Dixon. The book is called Damage. Hamilcar Publications putting it out. It's really an amazing book, and I strongly recommend it to anybody who is a boxing fan that wants to read about that topic. It's really well done. On our next show, we're going to be having an interesting conversation because we're going to be talking with Barry Tompkins and Tim Ryan, two of the greatest broadcasters that have ever done boxing, and two good friends of mine. And the reason we're going to have them on together is to talk about the four kings, Duran, Hagler, Hearns, and Leonard. And the reason we're talking about them is on June 6th, a documentary series, a 4-part documentary series called The Kings will debut on Showtime that will be, I think, the most comprehensive look at that era and the four kings that we have yet seen. And I'm looking forward to it, Trip. It's a topic that I think still has not been exhausted in terms of information.
Well, and you've talked about it, as a matter of fact, as recent as last week, that the 80s might be one of the top decades in the history of boxing. And having a little perspective on it, do you think it still holds up that way?
Yeah, I think it is. You know, Gil Clancy, who lived through many previous decades, told me he thought it was the best. and I certainly none after it has been better. And so I think it was. And the Four Kings were a big part of it. Well, speaking of boxing history, our good friend Tommy Ankello, who has his world-class boxing channel on YouTube, delves into the historical part of boxing a little bit, with also informational and instructional videos that are geared to amateur boxers and anyone that wants to know about the sport. Go over and check out his YouTube channel and enjoy that. So my thanks to Tris Dixon for guesting with us, and thanks to Trip for his fine job of co-hosting, and the Let's Do Something production folks who make this possible. We'll see you next time.